as you're thinking about jobs, there's two things that are really important and kind of what to do with your career. The first one is pick the job to take where you like and you're going to learn from the people that you work with. Not the people you work for, but the people you work with. Your colleagues, your teammates, your coworkers, pick the job that's the best fit there. That's super important. And second, if you can, go work for a company that's growing fast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the peopleHum interview series. I'm your host, Nayan Jadeja, and let's begin with a quick introduction of peopleHum. peopleHum is an end-to-end, one-view integrated human capital management automation platform, the winner of the 2019 Cody Award for HCM, that is specifically built and crafted for employee experiences and the future of work. We run the peopleHum blog and the video channel, which receives over 200,000 visitors a year, and publish at least 2 interviews with well-known names globally every month. Our guest today is Brian Kropp, Group Vice President at Gartner. He oversees the research, tools, services, and support that Gartner provides to CHROs. He has an impressive record of experience in business management, business development, strategy, and HR. And he's also listed amongst the top 100 HR tech influencers in the 2020 HR Technology Conference and Exposition. So welcome, Brian. Thrilled to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Great. So I guess, Brian, just for our audience, I think it will be good for, if you could walk through your journey in terms of, from where you started to what brought you into HR and then, ending up as the Group VP at Gartner.
Sure. So it's a little bit funny. I went to grad school. I got a PhD in applied economics. And I wanted to work for a professional services company. But I'd worked for a couple of other places before I ended up at what was then CEB. And when I was hired by CEB, I was actually hired into our HR practice. And I thought at that point in time I wasn't going to take the job because who wants to work in HR? That seems like a terrible idea. And then a couple of friends of mine convinced me, who I knew were working there at the time, convinced me that was actually a really good place to work. There was a lot of smart people. And plus, you could just be in the HR practice for a year or two and then go to one of the cooler places like finance or strategy or something like that. So I decided to take the job. And at first, in all honesty, I wasn't very excited by it. It seemed like, in all honesty, a little bit boring, thinking about HR and all these sorts of things that are there. But probably about a year in, I was lucky enough to have a conversation with one of the CEOs at one of the companies we work with. And I was talking to him about what his day was like. And as he was going through it, there's a realization that hit me at that point, which was, I don't know, about half, 2/3 of what a CEO does is actually HR. It's how do we find the right leaders? Do we have the right people in place to get things done? How do we make sure our best people don't quit? What is the right way to pay people? Some of these very fundamental questions about how do you run an organization, I had no idea that's what a CEO actually thought about at that time. And since that conversation, it gave me a totally different perspective on what managing your workforce looks like, managing your talent looks like, managing your leaders look like. And what I realized is that's the thing that actually really differentiates the best organizations from the average. And since that time, I've had a chance to look at a lot of different companies, analyze a lot of different companies, and not necessarily in the short run, because all sorts of things can impact how a company does in a short run, but the companies that consistently did better year after year after year after year were the ones that just did a better job of managing their workforce, managing their leaders, rewarding people fairly, doing all those sorts of things. And I realized how important it actually is in terms of what differentiates organizations from us. So that's kind of one big thing. Second thing that's been going on across this whole time period is that HR and talent management has very much gone from an art and kind of a gut around how people think what should be done, what people believe should be done, to a science that's managed with the art. And so if you think about all the data, all the measurement, all the analytics that have moved into HR, how much more we know about our employees, the people, the human beings that work for us, that scientific part of it has been incredibly attractive and interesting to me. And then with kind of those two big trends that were going along, I've been lucky enough to have all sorts of chances and opportunities to launch new businesses and serve new executives, to launch new businesses in new geographies, build new tools. And when I started working with the space, the organization I worked for at that time, CP, was quite small, and now a chance to be part of the largest leading organization when it comes to research and advice that's provided to executives. It's just been an amazing journey that when I first started, if you had told me that I would find this interesting, I would have laughed at you and then don't know where that corporate strategy job is, because that's what I thought, what I really want to do, but I couldn't have been more wrong in retrospect.
Right. I was kind of curious. Everybody talks when they're talking to their employees, right? Everybody kind of gives the message that, oh, people are the most important for us, right? Though rarely or very few organizations, actions kind of speak for words, right? And why do you think that is the case?
Well, I think there's a couple thoughts there, a couple things that are pretty interesting. Because I think you're right. Saying people are our most important asset was a talk track that wasn't really enforced when those values were tested. Because it was really easy to say, well, people are our most important asset, but business is a little bit tough, so let's lay off everybody. That was a very easy way to go after it. Where I think it really started to change, though, was actually during the financial recession of 2008, 2009. And there was a couple things that happened during that time period. One, going into that, what differentiated organizations was really becoming more and more not their access to capital, because everyone could have access to capital. Companies of any size could have access to capital. It wasn't necessarily their ability to be innovative, because the speed at which innovation moved across organizations just continued to accelerate. What actually happened was whether or not you've got the people that can continue to work hard, come up with that next innovation, engage those customers in the next way, and so on, became the differentiator. And there's a group of analysts, stock market analysts, that I've kept in touch with, had a chance to talk to, and I asked them, how did they analyze what happened during the financial recession? And one of the things that they did when they went back and looked at what happened during that time period is they realized that the companies that they thought were in great shape, a lot of them struggled during the financial recession and disappeared in many cases. Ones they thought were not in great shape actually did quite well. And they wanted to figure out, what in the world happened? And what they realized is that the companies, when they analyzed the text analytics of earnings calls, what's in financial statements, those sorts of things, the companies that placed a greater emphasis on managing talent, on average, were companies that were more likely to be successful during that time period than those who weren't. And so what's happened is a lot of those analysts now start to ask a lot more questions about the talent strategies, the leadership bench, all those sorts of things in terms of what's going on within this company. So that is one thing that's changed the reality of, from CEOs saying my most important asset, to actually realizing that the external financial markets forced it upon them. That's one thing. I think a second thing, society's forced it on them. When you look in the US, the fight for 15 in terms of a minimum wage, the fact that how you treat your employees has become a commercial differentiator. I think that is another reason why they're taking it more seriously. But I think kind of those factors. One, it's really the differentiator, and CEOs have realized that. Investors ask about it and push on it. And customers and communities ask about it and push on it. And I think that's where you get to what happened just about a year ago, where the Business Roundtable came out and said that we have to treat our employees as stakeholders. And well, not every CEO does that, for sure. There's been a marked difference in terms of the approach that a lot of CEOs take in terms of managing their workforce now. And I think it's a combination of all those factors. Not consistently true. You can always find the exception, for sure, but now compared to 10, 15 years ago, those factors are really different in terms of the importance that CEOs place on it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I have never kind of realized about the 2008-9 kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Curious. I mean, obviously, top of mind right now. We're going through the pandemic, right? And this again is a very crucial issue as employees kind of work from home.
Yeah.
You know, the caring of the employees kind of becomes front and center. So, in your opinion, is this going to make it even like at a take it to a totally different level, or what's your opinion kind of from
Yeah.
academic in this space?
Yeah, I think there's many things that are going to be fundamentally different post-pandemic, with vaccine, effective treatment, whatever causes that to happen, and whenever that occurs, compared to now. I think first and foremost is what a lot of senior leaders realize is that this is a humanitarian crisis, and so they're trying to treat their employees as humanely as possible. I think that, again, not consistently, but that's the overarching direction that companies and executives are going, which I think is important to point out. Because they're doing a lot of things now and that they wouldn't have done in 2008, 2009, or in other previous economic downturns. So for one, rather than laying off a lot of employees, companies were more likely to furlough employees, which kept them on for a lot of the benefits offerings that they had, which put a cost on companies that they didn't necessarily need to absorb. And you could argue, well, part of that was they weren't sure how long people were going to be out, so it's better to furlough than to lay off. True, but they could have saved more money if they'd taken a different approach, but they didn't for the most part. Two, what we saw is a lot of companies that were in fact hiring, they were partnering with companies that were having reductions in force to move employees from the company that was shrinking to the company that was growing, to make it as easy as possible and manageable for their employees. We're seeing that happening. Three, what we're also seeing is that companies are becoming a lot more flexible in terms of the relationship that their employees have with their employer around things like childcare offerings or other support that's there. So there's some companies that we work with that are giving their employees more leave to help take care of kids. There are some companies that we've worked with that are working with that are opening up their training offerings and their corporate universities to the spouses of their employees who have lost their job to help upskill them, which is a great thing to see from a humanitarian perspective. We're seeing one company that we work with, they're partnering, their corporate learning center, they have, because they've shut it down, they've actually opened it up to schools in their community to let schools use that space so they can actually get kids there and have enough space where kids can socially distance in those schools. So we're seeing companies becoming much more humane throughout this process in terms of supporting their employees. And I think that is, once that happens, it's really hard to unwind. Once you've gotten a much deeper, more intimate relationship with your employees, it's hard to turn it off. So I think that is a fundamental shift that's there. I think another obvious fundamental shift is that there's going to be a whole lot more people working remote than before. And the misinterpretation that I think a lot of people have on this is they view the world as there's going to be remote employees and in-office employees. I think the reality is we're going to have some employees that fall into those camps, but more we're going to have employees that are in the office some of the time and working from home some of the time.
Right.
And what we need to do is build an organization to manage this hybrid workforce, where people work where they want to work, and that's going to change day to day. They work when they want to work, and that's going to change day to day. Some people aren't going to want to work 40 hours a week. Some people are going to want to work 20. Some are going to want to work 60, whatever it might be. But we're going to see a massive increase in the amount of flexibility we offer our employees along where, when, and how much dimensions. And that's actually good because the research that we've done shows that when you give your employees those sorts of choices, they are actually more productive, they're more loyal. So not only are you better off as an employer by offering those choices, your employees are better off because then they have a job that better meets their life needs. So that's going to fundamentally change. A variety of other things as well in terms of kind of corporate locations. What do we do with all this office space? How do we think about creating more resilient organizations? A variety of other things that will change from there. But this when you look at all of these things that have happened from the pandemic, what's interesting about it in a lot of ways is these are not fundamentally different in kind things that we never thought about or never believed would occur. Instead, what's really happened with the pandemic is that a lot of things that were going to happen have been pulled forward really dramatically.
Right.
And so we've accelerated the future. So where we're going to be 7 years from now is where we are today. And that's really kind of the net effect of this, is that we've accelerated a lot of our future and made it more humane.
Putting some of the things that you mentioned, right? I mean, we are seeing the pace of innovation, the pace of change, obviously, is probably the fastest than it's ever been. And the pandemic is going to force, different ways of, I mean, obviously there's the humane angle, and then the ability to adapt. So do you think this is kind of the opportunity for like CHROs to grab this kind of pandemic that has come upon us, that's been thrust upon us, as an opportunity to kind of seek a seat at the table of the executives, where it's not only a support function, but literally an extremely critical part for the success of an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one, to the point about we're going to be working in completely different ways. People working from their home, working different times. The very nature of the idea that we come into an office consistently, work 8:30 to 5:30 consistently, is not going to be true anymore. So redesigning how work gets done is a critically important thing that heads of HR need to work through. It's kind of one big thing. This other reality out there as well, which is because of the humane part of it, companies are playing a much deeper, broader role in terms of society and what is the company's purpose beyond simply making money. That the head of HR needs to play a fundamentally different role in, because that goes to the very core and purpose of why does the company exist? And the labor market today, customers today, expect that answer to be something better than to make money. It's to do something. And what is that thing is critically an important role for the head of HR. I think the other really important role here is that as there's more automation, more AI, all those sorts of things as part of the digital transformation of work and organizations, it raises a ton of ethical and moral questions that are out there. And we believe that no one is better positioned than the head of HR to really think through those ethical and moral questions about how do we treat our employees, what do we measure about them, what do we understand about them. I mean, the reality is there's technology out there as part of this digital transformation where you can track every aspect of your employees. There are banks that we've worked with in Asia who map their customers' financial health with their work health, because a lot of their employees bank with them, so they're their employees and their customers, and use that to identify potential fraud that might occur when their employees' financial situations become problematic. And then they've started to create financial interventions for their employees who are at financial risk to prevent fraud from occurring, which at some level you can look at and say, well, that's a great thing. We're preventing crime from happening. But at another level, you say, well, is that the right line between companies and their employees or not? But there's a ton of ethical and moral questions that companies are going to have to address with the amount of data, information, digitalization, AI, all those sorts of trends that are occurring. And that's another incredibly important role that's there. And when you put all those factors together, if a CEO does not have their head of HR at that executive table with them and talking with the board with them, that's a company that is taking on an enormous amount of risk and potentially missing out on an enormous amount of upside opportunity by not having that critical voice there. One of the I mentioned earlier this idea of companies that have a sustained track record of being successful. One of the other characteristics about that is whether or not the head of HR reports into the CEO or reports into someone else. When the head of HR reports into the CEO, you see it perform better through time. Chicken and the egg, maybe, but that at a minimum correlation exists between the two, and should exist, we believe.
Right. And who do you believe shares more of the onus? Is it the CEO in terms of, how he or she thinks about the role, and so, seeking out the right talent to kind of head HR? Or do you think, HR needs to kind of push themselves to be more noticed and, take on that role or take on that mantle, so to say?
I think it's probably some of both. I think most CEOs, for lack of a better way to describe it, have kind of got a religion about the importance of managing the workforce. But they've got that understanding what's possible. So increasing the conversations that we're having with heads of HR, it's less about I need to convince my CEO that people are important, but more I need to show to my CEO and to show her what we can do to actually get that step change in performance. So CEOs believe, for the most part, in the value that's there. They just don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it. So, for example, there are, when it comes to kind of the role of companies in terms of driving social change, there's a lot of CEOs that say, well, I want to do it, but should I just make an announcement? Should we make an investment? Should I talk to my employees? What should I do? So they want to do it, but they need that head of HR to help them understand how to do it. It's funny, there's this expression out there, a phrase out there that being the CEO is the loneliest job at a company. And I would say it's the second loneliest job because the only person that a CEO can really talk to about their tough choices, their tough decisions, where they're uncertain is their head of HR. But that head of HR doesn't have anybody to talk to from that perspective. So I actually think the head of HR is the loneliest job that's there. But the heads of HR now need to come with solutions and those breakthrough innovative ideas on how they can really change that relationship and deal they've got with their employees and change that relationship and deal that company has with its customers. Because the CEOs, for the most part, want to do something, they just don't know what to do.
Right. There's obviously, you kind of touched upon again, a lot of automation, AI, tons of, data. We've kind of kept hearing of, HR analytics kind of coming in and, reshaping the industry. According to you, which of these trends really, is well suited to kind of impact the, kind of HR tech industry, and how or what needs to happen to make sure it's actually successful, right? Because we've talked about HR analytics, I think, for a few years, and there are probably some examples here and there, but I don't believe it's pervasive across, organizations. So would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, for sure. What's really interesting is starting the conversation not with HR analytics, but starting the conversation with marketing analytics and sales analytics, because marketing and sales are actually farther ahead than marketing and sales executives, I should say, are farther ahead than a lot of HR executives when it comes to tech and analytics. And a lot of that is because of e-commerce in many ways from back in the day when companies were starting to really collect data around if you bought this, you also bought that. How do people navigate the website? And that, even when you take a step earlier, you had a lot of analytics of kind of the in-store experience where you had cameras that would actually film people to see which way they went into a store, and then they would design the store layout in a way that was consistent with the natural human behaviors around how someone would walk through a store in terms of where they would put particular, like in a grocery store, why do they put certain things all the way at the back of the store? It's because those are the products that you go into the grocery store to buy, so you have to then walk by all the other stuff that you then see to buy the thing you have to buy, and hopefully buy some other things on the way. So when you look at sales analytics, marketing analytics, it was much farther ahead. And where HR analytics has emerged, and so kind of the process that went through was, let's try to understand the customer as a whole, and then it became much more specific to let's understand that customer as a whole, and created personas, and then got much more individualistic, and then can micro target specific customers around very specific activities that align exactly with what they're looking for, which is why when you go online now and you did that search for, whatever it might be, it constantly pops back up. It's like, are you still looking for this? Because it's micro targeted to you. HR analytics is going through a similar evolution. Where it started, it was about the engagement survey for the workforce. What does my workforce think? And then we started to segment that into business units, or demographic characteristics, or locations, or whatever it might be. And that next generation is taking that step that we saw occur in marketing and sales, which is going from the workforce or segments of the workforce to the individual. So what we're potential to be the most powerful, not in terms of simply understanding the workforce, but actually changing the behaviors of the workforce, is where we're able to get to the smallest micro segments of the workforce. So if we start with a philosophy around analytics, which is what can we do to change the behaviors of an individual employee, rather than what is it that we're doing to understand the workforce, those technologies and the companies that are pushing in that direction tend to get the most effective results for their clients and the companies that they work with, in terms of achieving goals like getting people to participate in fitness and wellness programs, getting them less likely to quit, getting them in the job that makes the most sense for them, and so on. So there's kind of that big part of it. With all of that said, though, what's different about HR versus sales and marketing is the ethical question, which is where there's still a lot of debate around, are you as an employee comfortable with your employer having all that specific information about you? We've tacitly said it's okay for the companies that we work with in our private lives too. We might complain about it, we might object to it, we might say we're going to quit whatever social media platform that we're going to say we're going to quit because they've got this. Then we turn around and keep using it. We don't change our behavior. And all the data shows that. But there's a different ethical question when it comes to the workforce that we're working on now. And so the question is, how do you get to that level of support for the individual employee in a way that is ethically and morally okay for that employee and the organization? And that's where the HR tech companies that do that are going to be ones that we believe are most likely to be advantaged. Now, there's another important caveat to note here, is that when you look at where the venture capital money's going, an enormous amount of it's going into the HR space and HR analytics space, because there's enormous opportunity that's there for sure. But a warning in that to the HR executives that are out there is, if you look at the amount of money that is going into the space from a VC perspective, and you look at the amount of money that companies are spending on analytics and HR tech, one of two things will have to occur for that market to achieve some sort of equilibrium. And there's always a shakeout in markets, but just as a whole, to achieve an equilibrium, is that the typical company is going to have to increase their spend on HR analytics, HR tech, from about 5 to 7% of their budget to about 15 to 20% of their budget to make the average HR tech company be viable. Or about 2/3 of those HR tech companies are going to fail. And that's just kind of the economics of the market. And so as an HR executive, if you're really looking to invest in the HR tech space, HR analytics space, understanding the health of the partners that you're picking is incredibly important, because there's a whole swath of those companies whose sole goal is to be bought by another company, and that's their purpose for existing, rather than helping a company achieve an outcome. But it's really understanding the economics of the space as an HR executive as you're going into this is incredibly important.
And I would be curious, what do you think is the reason behind so much interest in the HR tech space? I mean, is it just, it's a cycle, and every 8 to 10 years, the same industry kind of, we started with PeopleSoft in the late 90s, the success factors and, Connexa, IBM buying them, late 2000, whatever, I guess 10. And so is it that cycle, or is there something else driving this interest amongst kind of VCs and companies to start up in this space?
Yeah, I think so. It is cyclical, but it's cyclical on an upward ramp. Um, from that perspective, I think that's certainly true. Um, I think there is when you look at the profits that the companies in the broader tech space are able to generate and the financial success of those companies, a lot of investors look at that and say, gosh, we could absolutely replicate that within the workplace. And if we could capture something like that in terms of how we engage with employees, because, roughly speaking, when you look across the globe, about half the people on the planet have a job. And then probably 2/3 to 3/4 of those in a much more formal economy where would be valuable. So you do the math on that, you're saying, 3 billion people that are potentially users of these products is a huge market. And if you can capture a significant chunk of that market, you can have an amazingly and wildly successful company that's there. So there's opportunity that's there for sure. I think the bigger factor, though, is the long-term shift that's going on from HR, which is, when I first started doing research in the space, in art, and now much more science, and a science that is mixed with art, because it will never be a pure science because we're dealing with human beings here, but it will be a mix. That quantification, that analytification of HR and understanding of those relationships is absolutely critical and crucial. And so as HR has turned from an art gut feel to a science art combination, the need for this technology and capability and understanding and insights is paramount. And we're right at that point where we're shifting from getting information through all of this analytics and all this data and getting knowledge from it to gaining insight. Because we can, with all the data that we've got, we know, well, we have more employees that are like this than like that, our employees like this more than that. But what does that mean and what should we do? We're right at that pivot point where that data and information and knowledge is turning into insight. And as it breaks into insight, then we're going to have even more power and capability to make really good, smart decisions with our workforce.
Interesting. I did want to go back to, since you kind of mentioned, e-commerce, and, everybody kind of talks about, the philosophy or culture in a company. And, you have Amazon, where it's all about customer centricity. And then from an HR point of view, there is kind of like the employee centricity, right? Mm-hmm. So what is your view of one versus the other, or how do they kind of tie in, and what would be your thoughts around that?
I don't think they're different. And I would also layer in a bit more complexity, because it's not just about the customers and the employees in terms of the centricity around that. You also have your investor community that is paying attention to what you do. And so investors now more than ever care about how you treat your customers and you treat your employees. And there is community centricity around what role and impact are you having within the lives and communities and environments that you work and operate in. So what I would actually posit is what you need to do as a company is identify what is the common thread that you have across your customers, your employees, your communities, and your investors, and what is the value proposition that you want to build for all four of those constituency groups, rather than just saying customers or employees. Because what happens if you kind of just pick one, you run into all sorts of problems. Like a very funny story. There's a financial services company that we're working with, where their customer value proposition and employment value proposition were terribly misaligned. And essentially what happened, it was a company that holds a lot of people's retirement money. And I was talking to their head of HR, and they were looking through the Wall Street Journal. They opened it up one day, and on one side of the page, as they opened it up, back when we read newspapers that were paper, opened it up and saw an ad for their products, which was, we're safe, we're secure, we don't take risks, we ensure your retirement successful. And on the other side had a ad for to work at the company, which was we want people who are risk-taking, who are able to take that new challenge. And it's like the last thing you want to do is like, we're safe and secure with your retirement money, but we want people who are super risky. And without identifying that common thread across everything, you're just likely to create misalignment. And so identifying that thread that unites all of those stakeholders, and then building your company's story and vision around that common thread, I think is what is how we have to approach it.
Interesting. All right, I guess my final question, what advice would you give, the graduates of 2020 in terms of who are thinking about careers, and especially related to, the space where when you started off, you weren't looking at it for more than a year or two in terms of making this.
Yeah, there's all sorts of advice that people can give around like, go pursue your passions, it'll work out, blah, blah, blah. I think the people who tend to say that are people where it's already worked out for them and they've been hugely successful, not necessarily the average person from that part of it. What I would say is that the nature of work has changed a lot, and organizations have changed a lot. It is less about the top-down approach. It is less about kind of what your boss says or what your CEO says. As you're thinking about jobs, there's two things that are really important and kind of what to do with your career. The first one is pick the job to take where you like and you're going to learn from the people that you work with. Not the people you work for, but the people you work with. Your colleagues, your teammates, your coworkers. Pick the job that's the best fit there. That's super important. And second, if you can, go work for a company that's growing fast. The reason why is that when you're working with a company that's growing fast, you're going to get the chance to be in the room and be part of the conversation that you don't have a right to be part of because you haven't done your time, you haven't done all those sorts of things, because those growth companies just need people to do stuff. And so the best choice that you can make is go work with people that you like and you can learn from at a growth company. And if you can find that job, take that one. Don't worry about what industry it's in. Don't worry about what your role is. Don't worry about what the boss is like. Pick that job over other jobs.
Interesting. Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, Brian. Very insightful. I loved the conversation. I'm sure our audience will learn a lot from this. So thanks for taking the time and providing your insights to all of us.
Great. Thanks for having me. Talk to you soon.
Yeah.